TVOT.
Universal Media IDs, something we all can give a damn about.
Yeah, cell phones off if you have them. Thank you for finding your way up the stairs here. I guess I wasn't at the opening. I guess Tracy didn't advertise this too well, but at least the people who are interested in this topic found it. Hardcore Universal Media ID crowd here. So, I'm not going to be speaking to these slides. There's 2 slides. They're on a continuous loop. They are just some slides that kind of demonstrate or talk a little bit about IDR, Entertainment ID Registry, and Ad ID. And the Ad ID one is actually even more generic. It's just talking about the need for universal media IDs. So those are just on a loop. We're not going to be talking to them unless you have questions about them. We can answer that, or if the panelists here want to talk to them. So welcome to the Universal Media ID panel. We've got our distinguished panel here of speakers. We have Rebecca Lim, Senior Director at STARS, going down this direction here. Harold Geller, Managing Director of Ad ID, and for the title there,
SVP Cross Industry Workflow.
Okay. Then we've got Jane Clark, Managing Director of Coalition for Innovative Media Measurement, SIM. And then we have Kip Welch, who's from Vice President of Movie Labs and the President of Entertainment ID Registry that his company and my company just set up recently. I'm Judd Carey from Cable Labs, mostly in the legal space, but I do some other stuff in this area as well. So one of the topics of TV of the future is trying to figure out how to deliver innovative services and interactive services to consumers. And there's a lot of players involved in that space if you think about it through the whole supply chain. You've got your content, the content providers, you've got your post-production, you have content processing, content aggregation, you have the distributors, so that's where cable comes in, but there's a myriad of platforms there. You've got satellite, IP, cable, lots of different platforms even in all of those spaces. Then on the back end, of course, you've got all your VOD servers, all of your back office, billing, ad insertion. It's just a very complex system to get interactive services in particular from end to end to the consumer. And then after you do all of that, of course, you have to measure it. You need to measure the ads, the ad plays, do reporting and analytics. And then the consumers today, of course, are demanding more and more various devices. So you've got your iPads, your mobiles, your PCs, your game boxes, big screen TVs, anywhere, it's the 4 Annies, any device, anytime, any place, in any format. So, let's layer on top of that all the different distribution competitors that are coming into play. So you have, even the FCC has created a new category of distribution, which is OVDs, online video distributors. So they've recognized that that's just a booming space, so there's even more and more content, and more types of content. So how do you keep track of all of that in any meaningful manner without, pulling out your hair, which I've probably already done. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think one big step forward, very big step forward, is to come up with some sort of a universal media ID for all content. And there's different ways of doing that, and we've looked at the space. We have the IDR company, Entertainment ID Registry. We have Ad ID for advertising. But where I think I'd like to start is we're very privileged to have Jane here because they just got done doing a broad survey with Ernst & Young, and she can explain this to us. A whole survey of all the executives in the space. What do you want? What's the problem? How do we solve this? And I'd like for her, if you can start off going over a little bit of the impetus behind that survey and then some of the results to the extent that you can divulge them. I think it's coming out soon, but you can.
Today.
Okay, so, and I'm going to sit down here and we can just have a discussion. And if you guys have any questions at any time, let us know, and I'd like to incorporate that into our discussion too.
So this is working. Here we go. So SIM, for anyone who doesn't know, that's what we call, that's kind of our short acronym for the Coalition for Innovative Media Measurement. And it's a coalition of 22 companies that cover media companies, media buying agencies, and large advertisers. And they came together about a year or two ago to innovate in some different areas of audience measurement. One is the use of set-top box data for television measurement, and the second is cross-platform measurement. So even before you get to the whole world of the future that Judd's talking about and interactivity, we're challenged in the current environment today with tracking how content moves across television, online, mobile, iPads, through all of these different, cutting it up and putting the video up on YouTube, and all of the variety of ways that we all know that all of the booming content can be distributed. So when we sat down with our cross-platform working committee and said, well, how are we going to tackle this area of cross-platform measurement, everyone kept saying, well, couldn't you have a UPC code for media, just as a simple way of describing it? And so we started out with that premise, and we put together an RFP and talked to a bunch of different consultants and got Ernst & Young to go around and basically try to answer this question. And they did sort of depth interviews with, it was over 60 executives and over 20 different companies throughout the whole media and entertainment ecosystem. So some of the research companies, some of the technology companies, the distributors, the content owners. And the thing, just as an aside also, is that research is only one of the benefits of all of this, which we'll be discussing. There's so many, there was one guy we spoke to who talked about the 4 R's, the residuals, rights, royalties, and research or ratings, whatever you want to call it, audience measurement. So we're, in a way, maybe we're even coming late to the party and just saying, hey, this is really important for research and ratings. And so we included all the measurement companies in our survey as well, because our big concern is, can you end up with some better way to measure and track all of this? So at the end of all of it, they basically came back and said, yes, the ecosystem really wants an open and interoperable standard for tracking content and ads throughout the whole media ecosystem. And even people who have proprietary ways of doing that now are very open to having a standard that everyone can work with, which surprised us a bit, because we thought that some of the people with proprietary standards would really just want to keep their own unique way of doing it. But there's kind of a tipping point, and I think it's partly because of what he was saying, that there's just so much content, there's so many new ways to distribute it, that it's just, and we can't move on to a lot of these areas of interactivity and more innovative uses of television until you have this basic, almost like plumbing layer put together. So that was what we found. People really wanted. There were 6 criteria. Should I go into that quickly now? Or
Yeah, you could go do that
you
quickly.
want to wait? I'll just
Sure.
say them pretty quickly, and then we can talk about some of them. But the main thing, though, was that in order to do this, it has to be simple. So it has to be easy to implement and operate, which is, not a small feat. It has to be interoperable. So, if we were starting from scratch today and inventing a UPC code for media, we might do it differently. But, right, we're in an environment where there are existing codes available now, and so the best way to move forward is to make all these interoperable, to have a technical solution to make them interoperable. It needs to be inextricably bound so that the IDs can be permanently linked to the content and won't be lost as it goes through transcoding and all of the different technical phases that you all know more about than I do. It needs to be extensible, which is a way of kind of saying it's future-proof. So as much as we can anticipate future uses to try to plan ahead. It needs to be open and global so that everyone can use it. All these companies are global companies. You have the same problem around the world. And it needs to be cost effective. So it needs to be kind of a value driven with a low cost way to get in and get started and make it work.
Right. So, I mean, you bring up a lot of good points. There's prior history here, of ISBN with books, UPCs with goods. it's amazing to me. It took us this long to actually get around to doing this. But Kip, let's start at the top of the food chain here, I guess, from content. What's the history here? How come it did take us so long? And maybe to answer some of Jane's 6 points that she brought up, how did the movie industry decide to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to think a little bit about critical mass and what's been happening in the industry in the last few years. I mean, you heard Tracy downstairs talking about, okay, maybe we've actually reached that point. What's the word that's when you talked about forever convergence? Well, in the last couple of years, you've had the cable industry sort of move massively online with TV everywhere. The amount of content that's being distributed and just streaming through all the servers out there that's going into people's homes has just exploded to such an extent that you can no longer manage it with a jerry-rigged set of, all right, it's going to get there someday, let's not spend much money on it, let's just keep it functioning. It's at the point where it's slowing down commerce, it's raising costs unreasonable, and it's reducing revenues to not have it better organized.
Yeah.
And I think that tipping point is really what's pushed the industry to say, look, we've talked about this for a while, we've played with different concepts, it's now time to just make it happen, because if we don't, we're really going to regret it. And if we do it, 3 or 4 years down the road, we'll just be so happy we solved this problem. It's reached that time, basically.
Yeah. And Harold?
And the other thing, just to add to what Kip said, what's interesting about the time that we're in right now is we have such a digital infrastructure, or sort of digital landscape, where you're starting to see the need for interoperability. And to Jane's point, to the SIM taxi initiative, you see times where information about whether it's episodic or long form content, or whether it's ads, that information gets rekeyed in multiple places, multiple times. We've done some tracking studies in Ad ID that talks about ads being rekeyed 20 times. Information about ads, whether you're talking about the name of the advertiser, the name of the product, and the same thing happens in terms of producers, in terms of other elements of content, and that doesn't even apply to the areas of aggregation. So now, even though it's being rekeyed, it's not being rekeyed exactly the same. We've got cross-reference tables. I think we're beginning to see.
And it's error-prone too.
Yeah, all of these errors. We have built in our whole ecosystem. We've built a marketplace of workarounds.
Yeah.
And I believe the workarounds are beginning to fall apart. And I believe that's what Jane and Ernst & Young have seen, is the time is right. And so we've with IDER coming onto the marketplace, one of the things that's really key about this time, and this time in our history, is we've now got the word interoperable has really become very important. And now when we have Ad ID and IDER sitting at the same table, being able to do those use cases and actually say, if we have a piece of episodic content, and content, as Jane said and as Kip said, content is what it's all about. It's about the consumer wanting to see their content on all the various platforms. And you talked about some acronyms, but we'll talk about online video, OVP, OTT, MVPDs, all of those different ways of consuming content. It's now becoming so complex that you really do need to get to focus heavily on content identification and the descriptive information that's associated with it. How do you accurately describe a piece of content? What's the descriptive information that is specific to the domain? So you might have the producer of a production, you might have the name of the program, the advertiser name, all of those things which are domain specific, which actually works beautifully in the work that Ad ID and IDER have done together.
I was just going to also add that so many individual media companies are starting to do this on their own. So if the industry doesn't come together soon and do this as an industry, the individual media companies are just developing, and content owners are just starting to develop their own ways of tracking all of this.
Yeah.
And then it becomes even, much more of a complex mess, because now you have all these house IDs and
Proprietary
everybody
solutions.
doing everything differently. Nothing's going to work. You can't have machines talking to machines when they all have different languages.
Yeah. The statistic I have here is that it says that over the 40 years, UPC has saved the industry $17 billion. Just having a UPC code for goods, So to your point, instead of transcoding this 20 times, you do it once, and you have less errors, and you save a lot of money in the transactional costs.
There was one more thing too, from a research point of view, is that the research vendors who have to measure content, something like 30% of their cost is wrapped up not in just measuring it, but in actually getting back and identifying it and figuring out what it is.
Yeah. So maybe Kip and Harold can give 2 minutes, only allow 2 minutes on a soapbox of the 2-minute presentation of what is IDER and what is ad ID. And then I'd also like to ask, okay, and how are they going to work together? Is that on, Kip?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, IDER is new. This is first full year of operation, but it's essentially a UPC code for movie and TV content. That's exactly what it's set out to be. It's dead cheap. It's interoperable. It's organized and run by the movie and TV ecosystem. It's a nonprofit. It provides a service. It's essentially a registry where you can register movie and TV content all the way down from title level, feature films down to a 30-second clip of episode 79 of series 4 or something like that. It's intended to be as granular as you need it to be to support any form of commercial distribution. It's not for informal, non-commercial content. It's really about enabling B2B transactions, and it's got a system up and running now, and it's starting to ingest content from major metadata providers, major content providers. We're working very closely. It's actually sponsored by the cable industry and the movie and TV industry jointly, together with Rovi, which is one of the sponsors of this event, and the metadata industry and other metadata suppliers. It's got a lot of support around the industry, and we're really trying to get enough critical mass behind it in 2011 to solve the problem of having this solution in place that we can all share and understand, have all of our systems talking back and forth to each other in ways that they understand. So that's really what it is.
One quick thing is you might explain what it is not, as far as the metadata that's in it.
Yeah, it's not IMDb for movies, right? It's not going to replace a metadata supplier. It's not going to replace commercial services for information around movies. It's intended to organize and help organize all that commercial and consumer information, but it's never going to be that be-all and end-all of all the interesting information about movies. That's still going to come from the existing expert providers that already exist in the industry. This is just a way to organize all that information to give systems, consumers, businesses, anybody who needs to better and easier access to that information.
Harold, two
Geez,
seconds
can
on ad ID.
Can I just put a ditto mark
Yeah.
against everything that Kip just said and just replace everywhere he said content with advertising?
Right.
We're the UPC code for advertising. We're a joint venture of the American Association of Ad Agencies and the Association of National Advertisers. Very much in the same model as UPC was, and very much in the model of IDER, where you're talking about the industry developing the standard. This is not a independent vendor coming in and saying we have a proprietary solution. Open standard, powered by web services. So we are in many ways a services-oriented architecture where people can access the data about an ad, and we get we have 70 descriptive fields, with 13 of those fields are really what we call our digital slate, which really is the descriptive information that moves throughout the supply chain. And when Jane talks about the R's, that's when we talk about the operations, the measurement, and the aggregation of information about advertising assets. And we've been around since 2003. Grown from less than 100 advertisers. We're now used by over 700 advertisers. In 2010, 166,000 ads were identified with ad ID. That's in a market across all platforms. If you talk about just video, there's probably about 300,000 unique ads that are created every year. So we're somewhere around a third of the marketplace. And now that we've got that critical mass, we can actually start to develop the use cases that are important throughout that supply chain. And when the Association of National Advertisers talks a lot about the importance of the supply chain. And when you talk about the importance of the supply chain and making sure that you do things that are appropriate for people further along your supply chain, well, that makes you more capable. So if you actually go to the ANA's website and look at the Marketer's Constitution, number 5 on the Marketer's Constitution talks about the need for supply chain excellence. And number 6 on that Marketer's Constitution talks about the need to become increasingly more capable. And they are a cause and effect. And I think that goes very much for IDER as well as the work, the industry work that Sim is doing, so that in a nutshell.
Not to leave Rebecca out here.
Never this quiet.
I know.
Ever.
We brought Rebecca on here. She's not, STARS is not a member of IDER or AdID that I know of, but we wanted like kind of a reaction from somebody from the content community. And what, just from listening to the panelists so far, what new services or how would you see utilizing IDER or AdID? Does that help you in tracking? Does it help you in organizing your assets? Does it help you in inserting ads into your advertisements? How do you see you using this to make your operations more efficient?
Okay. Well, I have a couple of questions, but let me just kind of frame where we're at. So I noticed that there's some of the studio partners that we have that are part of the consortium. So however they're going to insert the identifiers will be interesting to us and see how that passes along. But then I was talking to Judd and I was trying to understand, so if we put a bumper on the front of it that says STARS because we're playing it out in a online situation where we have no other sort of branding, is that means that's a new one, right? That's a new identifier, or that's one that it stays with it. I think the other thing is we're trying to understand so let's say we distribute Disney, Toy Story 3. Toy Story 3 is available on iTunes. It's available on STARS under subscription package. It's available in other places in pay-per-view. It's also available at Walmart. It's available for people's eventually ultraviolet into a digital locker. So I think we're trying to understand how the identifiers roll across, just from the organizational and where it lives, like in some kind of header in the content or something. So that's one thing. But I think bottom line, I'd like to understand how this will help us bring content better for our customers. And right now, when we try to do interactive TV applications, like we're doing one with eBIF, that's basically a one-click from on-air to on-demand. So you're watching STARS, you come in, some of you have probably seen it before, you miss the beginning of the movie, and we have an application that comes up in eBIF that says, do you want to start this again? Do you want to see our top titles? Currently, we're making a VOD call. So we have to make sure that the VOD identifier, the VOD identifier against the cable app spec is there in our application, but then also in the MSOs, because sometimes some of those things get changed in transport, and so that's been one of our biggest issues, is we have no way of knowing whether it's there or not, but that's one thing. And then the other one is, eventually, we don't want any PII, we don't want to know the customer, the affiliates own the customer, we don't, right? We're a supplier. But if we could know that your house watched Toy Story 3 and this house watched, Hitch or some kind of, or let's say, some kind of action, not Hitch, but some kind of action movie, and this house really likes action and this house really likes kids and comedy, could we use those identifiers to then bring them recommendations? I mean, those are the kind of things I think from a programmer, we don't have any ads, so that doesn't, sorry, we're premium. So those are the kinds of things that I just wanted to kind of kick off as ideas of how this could be used for the programming community.
Yeah, I think you're hitting it right on in this conference, right? If you think about TVOT Tomorrow conference, it's about interactive TV, and that's exactly the sweet spot for new services that can be delivered if you can get a bunch of different companies providing different services and technologies that all are talking about the same thing, right? You can't get Zytera to be talking about the same asset that Cable Labs is identified in the VOD spec, and that the tracking provider is also tracking with the same thing, and that 5 other service providers that may be in line between you and the ultimate consumer and delivering something to that consumer, their systems aren't talking to each other directly, but they all need to be talking about the same movie that's being delivered by STARS to that consumer, so that the services delivered around that are accurate and they're getting a service designed for the consumer of that asset. That's the sort of thing that IDs that tell everyone that people can share, that are externally referenceable, actually help deliver. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the interactive context for the use of identifiers in the way that you're describing.
And I think a little follow-on, too, to answer one of your questions is, how is that going to be done? that's kind of the process we're in right now. I mean, probably following on from some of Jane's work, and as well as what Kip and I are doing with IDER, is figuring out where in the standards where does that IDER actually exist. So Cable Labs has modified our specifications. I know Ultraviolet there's a placeholder where you could put an IDER number. There's different standards, SCTE, SMPTE, all of those that we're kind of running around to quickly to say, where would you put an IDER? And then it would be defined.
Yeah, and that's also what we discovered. And by the way, the name, I think I didn't even say the name of what we called the study, just to have another acronym, was the Trackable Asset Cross-Platform Identification Study. And so what we found was this was just the first phase, which was, do people want it? Is it technically feasible? Is it operationally feasible? Once we got those answers that said yes, the main other finding was that you need a couple of these use cases, and you need a couple of pilot studies of these use cases that prove the technical feasibility and show how you would do exactly what she just described, and B, that you could prove the business case to senior management. Because what's happened is that you have a lot of technical people around the industry talking about this, but you don't have a lot of CEOs around the industry talking about the need for this yet, at least that I've heard. Yeah. And so we found that if we do, our next step here is to put together some pilot tests with a variety of content distribution partners using AdID and IDER. We've identified as the best partners for the asset identification piece, and put it all. It's going to take like a few months to even get it all together and plan it, and then we'll execute the pilot test, and hopefully, within 9 to 12 months, we'll actually have some results to report back to the industry that says, here's how you do this in a couple of these different use cases. Here are the benefits that it's going to give to the industry, and here's the business case, so that senior management can then say, hey, do this. What's the problem? We need to just get the evidence for people.
Yeah. I think my other question would be then, so how does this work with the data measurement that Canoe is putting in place? I'll give you the mic. And so is an interactive layer that you would put on an ad enough to give it a new number? And would it be, would that help track some of, because not all ads are going to have interactivity, right? So could you just kind of tell me that?
Sure. And that's actually a use case that we're working on right now with Canoe. Because part of the issue that happens is that you've got individual interactive layers that might run on multiple networks. And so that same interactive item that Canoe might call something is going to go into into a cable network or into an MSO and get a house number, and now you're referring to it as one thing, and the MSO might be referring to it as something else. Canoe might be referring to it as something else. So the idea would be everything that is unique should be identified and should be described. So depending on, based on that use case, and we're just at the early stages of doing that work, the interactive layer is developed by Canoe, let's say. Canoe applies a unique identifier, and that gets somehow embedded inside, and likely embedded inside the header of the file. And then as that moves through the operations, that identifier moves with it. And so talk about what we call intrinsically bound? Inextricably bound. Inextricably bound. So again, it all goes back to those 6 attributes that we've been talking about. If it's inextricably bound and we call it the same thing, one of the things that is a serious problem, and I've spent a lot of time with the taxi report, one of the problems is this proliferation of house coding. Every asset, when it arrives at a facility, gets assigned a house code. That house code then refers to a unique identifier, which is discarded. It's discarded until somebody needs it for reporting. So it isn't, so you get into this mix-up and this mash-up of which identifier is the right one and which one is authoritative. And so we get into this whole conversation. So part of it is get it in early in its life cycle, rather than downstream when somebody needs to describe it that may not have all of the accurate descriptions to apply to it.
to follow on from what Jane was saying, one of the next steps is getting these proofs of concept. I think you have an upcoming interop. Actually, we're doing with Cable Labs.
Yes.
Can you explain what's going to be going on there, or
So
what you're proving in your proof of concept?
So as Judd said, next week Cable Labs has their advertising interoperability event, and this will be the first time that this is an advertising interoperability event where they're actually going to be using unique identification going from the ingest of a commercial to play out to measurement. So we've actually worked very closely with all of the vendors who are participating in this interop to actually say, don't use house identification, use the unique identification that comes from ad ID and pass that through. My team has been working very closely with TVN, with Harris, and with Cable Labs to actually make sure that all travels. And that's the key. You know, it begins, and as the slide up there says, it begins with operations. So if you flush from the system the house identification, which is the goal next week, you know, let's move it through. Find the issues where I could pass this unique identifier from the ingest system to the trafficking system to the playout system to the measurement system, and then all the way through. Then what are the benefits of that? So that's what we're really trying to prove next week.
Right.
And as I say, my team has been working very closely, and we've actually been providing that descriptive information, the metadata files, directly to Cable Labs and their providers. So inside of Cable Labs 3.0 metadata schema is not a proprietary schema of descriptive information, but ad ID's schema of identification of what we call the digital slate, that descriptive information. And Judd and I were talking about earlier, the next interop ends up becoming content and gets driven by IDER. And that then, then you start, and as I say, key takeaway, flush out the house identifiers, that then gives you something. And we've got a question down here if you wanted to throw it.
Yeah.
Moving forward, I can
Oh.
understand this. Okay, I'm getting ready to initiate productions on projects which are specifically going to be distributed via the internet. Okay, if I want to get a IDER from the production level, would I be able to do that?
Yes.
Okay, and how easy is it for me to be able to do it? Let's say I have these three features that I'm planning to distribute solely over the internet. Would I be able to go to a website and be able to get my IDER based on what's just on the script, not what the ultimate product is going to look like?
You can get, so there's a process that's set up. If you have a project that's in development but isn't public yet and you wanted to do an in-development registration, you could do that.
Okay.
And then it could be promoted to a publicly available registration at some point in time when your production was actually completed.
Right. There was another question.
Yeah, so the notion of inextricably bound at an engineering and operations level is an oxymoron. Right?
It can always be stripped.
Right? You can't actually achieve that with something that you attach to the underlying content because it can be detached, right? And you look at your kind of plan, it sort of draws into focus an awful lot of different parties, and noticeably service providers and their set-top box and TV OEMs, right? How do you plan for a future where set-top boxes are apparently fading from our future, TVs look like the display terminal, and yet TV OEMs and service providers are going to wrestle with who gets to zoom who on those many, many tasks there. So, I mean, in IDER in particular, I think there's a really big conflict of interest that you have to resolve to actually get through to the smart device, be it a high-end set-top, of which there will be few, or a high-end TV, of which there'll be many in the future. I mean, it seems like it's got a problem getting through the system.
Yeah, so what we are starting off with IDER is how to identify the content. The number of workflows that the ID could be attached to is almost limitless. The ways in which it could be attached to or bound to a piece of content or into a workflow are, again, almost limitless. There will be numerous discussions, proof of concept projects, other ways where different parts of the workflow in the movie and TV ecosystem have to sit down and say, okay, how are we going to put it in this? How are we going to put it in the transport stream for certain types of workflows? Those will be ongoing discussions that I would anticipate will go on for quite a long time to figure out the right way to put it in so they can be passed easily through the systems.
That's for sure, but I think the larger problem is coming to the treaties that actually cause it to get all the way through the system successfully. So the technical problem is the small one, in my view.
Yeah, and that's where we're working with quite a few of the standards bodies. I mean,
Yeah.
and if you could get to the lowest level, I mean, and we do a lot of work with MPEG. You know, if you get to the lowest level of a transport descriptor data field that's required at the transport level, true, it can be stripped out, and some set-top boxes may not even pass it. But we're making sure that it's
uncompressed pixels when it gets
Yeah.
set up. There's no metadata.
right.
That's why smart TVs do this. I think that's why smart TVs don't know today what's
Right.
Yeah, so
Just before we go on to the next question, one of the things that we've done in the ad space is start to look at, and my board will sort of goes at me when I talk about this. We talk about acronym soup. You know, we've got SMPTE, the Advanced Media
MPEG.
Workflow Association. We've got Adobe with their XMP technologies, and as Kip said, there will be a plethora of inextricably binding technologies. However, what we've chosen to do over the years is start to choose a few of those technologies and start to look at the use cases going end to end. The issue of data ownership is a very serious one. When we talk about set-top boxes, whether you're talking about the set-top box, the cable set-top box that we have today, or the proprietary set-top boxes like the TiVos, or even some of the Blu-ray players or the connected devices, that becomes very challenging. And that is where, where Kip is absolutely correct. We've got to get down to the point of identifying the content and then getting the variety of methods of either inextricably binding or at least having the metadata and the identification traveling alongside the asset.
So anyways, I'm Dan Akins from Cytera. Thanks, Kip. The question I have is that so we can actually fingerprint it on a TV, let's say. We go into a database, we extract back either an ad ID that we can get from you, or we can get right now a TMS ID for episodes, and that's what we currently do. So the TV, even though it might be, in your case, you could say inextricably bound, it's stripped off, at some point you can get back to what it was. And I think that will become a delivery service that will be provided. I mean, that's what we're providing as a company, a layer.
Watermarking.
Right, a layer to do that interactively. So I guess my question more is for Kip and maybe for Harold too, is to follow up on is how do you actually translate from, because there are limits to TMS ID. For instance, if I'm watching the sports channel or if I'm watching the 6 o'clock news, I get the same ID every day. You know, how do you deal with situations like that, and how do you translate between what the IDER is and the TMS ID?
That's a very good question, because we are actually actively talking to TMS about doing exactly that, as we are with Rovi, as we are with baseline research, as we are with other folks in the metadata industry, because there is never a one-to-one matching between different databases of content. You have to figure out and do a hierarchy mapping and figure out a good process for understanding what you're just trying to identify, and then do kind of a specialized mapping between them. But for all of the major metadata providers in the movie and TV ecosystem, we're going to be doing that. Rovi has committed that they're going to have IDER IDs in all of their data feeds by the end of this year. I would expect Tribune to be, trying to get someplace about the same time. We've been talking to them quite a lot about this. So I think there's some work to be done to figure out how that mapping occurs, but it's not an intractable, impossible problem, and I think the right people are engaged. We'll figure it out.
I think that's all the time we have. Is that right? We're being.
It is.
Okay.
I think if this were a drinking game, and inexplicably bound were the phrase, none of us would make it to lunch. But this has been a fascinating panel. I'm sure you might have questions for these individuals. I would track them down throughout the conference and follow up with them. But thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you, panel.